Welcome to this edition of IBFD's Tax Takes News and Views, bringing you the week's tax news in a nutshell. I'm Barry Larking, Special Counsel at IBFD, and with me for our Beyond the News interview is Stuart Gibson, IBFD's Chief Editor, Global News in Washington, D.C. On today's show, global tax competition heats up as countries introduce more recovery measures. Russia lifts VAT on domestic retailers while the Bahamas does the opposite, and the European Commission launches legal challenges to member states' tax laws. These and more coming up on IBFD's Tax Takes, including Stuart Gibson's interview with Georgetown tax law professor Itai Grinberg on the challenges an incoming Biden administration will face on the international tax front. First, we turn to the top news of the past week as reported in IBFD's Tax News Service. The United States and France have at last found something they agree on, announcing that they're ready to conclude a deal to exchange country-by-country reports. While France has been exchanging reports with EU member states for the past 5 years, the US arrangement has taken a bit longer, so the exchange with France will only kick in from 2019. Spain is another slow starter, this time when it comes to the EU's anti-avoidance directive. While Spain should have implemented the directive by the beginning of the year, and in some cases even earlier, the government has only now put forward changes, in particular on exit taxation and controlled foreign companies, in an attempt to conform to the directive. And Spain may not be the only offender, as the Commission has recently identified at least 12 other member states that failed to implement the EU anti-avoidance rules. Poland will fundamentally change its corporate tax system beginning next year when it introduces rules that allow small and medium-sized companies to defer tax on profits until they're distributed. This new distribution tax mirrors the much-admired Estonian tax system, which allows companies generally to defer tax until distribution. At the same time, Poland will introduce a tax-free investment reserve, and both moves aim to promote investment and help the economy recover after the COVID crisis. As more countries are considering measures to kickstart their economies out of the COVID-19 economic crisis, some, including Argentina and Finland, are looking at how R&D incentives may help. Argentina has relaxed the entry requirements for activities like software, digital, and IT services, enabling more businesses to qualify for benefits that include a 50% cut in the corporate tax rate. The Finnish government is proposing an additional 50% deduction for qualifying R&D costs to promote joint projects between businesses and universities. While some countries adopt targeted tax incentives to spur economic recovery, others prefer the old-fashioned way, cutting the tax rate. Among them is Tunisia, which has proposed a competitive 18% corporate tax rate to replace some of its current varied rates. Meanwhile, Spain is moving in the opposite direction, proposing tax hikes in individual income tax, wealth tax, and VAT. Spanish-based multinationals may also suffer if, as proposed, the current exemption for corporate dividends and capital gains is cut from 100 to 95%. While the OECD focuses on the corporate income tax implications of digital transactions under its Pillar 1 proposals, other countries are tackling digital commerce through value-added taxes, but not all countries are taking the same approach. The Bahamas, which has no corporate income tax but does have a value-added tax, is stepping up the pressure on online multinationals such as Facebook to ensure that they pay VAT on advertising services provided in the Bahamas. The move is intended to eliminate the competitive advantage that foreign service providers now have over local companies that currently pay VAT. Russia has taken the opposite approach. Instead of extending its VAT to remote digital providers that are currently exempt, it proposes to eliminate their competitive advantage by also exempting Russian providers. And harmonizing VAT across multiple jurisdictions is no easy task, as the recently updated EU guidelines demonstrate. The new guidelines weigh in at some 266 pages and address hundreds of questions on how to apply the EU's VAT rules in a uniform way. Not surprisingly, the latest update includes various Brexit-related issues, as well as questions arising under the EU's quick fixes package. And now moving on to other news. The European Commission has just published a long list of member states' tax provisions that it says do not comply with EU law, in particular the non-discrimination rules and the EU's fundamental freedoms. Check out IBFD's Tax News Service for the full picture. Spain is clamping down on cash transactions in its latest bill on tax fraud by reducing the maximum amounts of cash that can be paid by businesses and certain individuals. And finally, the Maldives has announced that tax evasion involving more than about 25,000 euros will now be considered a, quotes, serious offence, end quotes, under its criminal code. And, well, you may think, not a moment too soon. Now we go beyond the news to Stuart Gibson's interview with Itai Grinberg on the US elections. Stuart.
Thank you, Barry, for your informative news report. I'm Stuart Gibson, Chief Editor of Global News here at IBFD. I'm joined today by Itai Grinberg, Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Itai.
Hi, it's wonderful to be with you, Stuart. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us. During your career, you've focused on international tax policy, including stints working at the U.S. Treasury and advising not just the OECD, but also Presidents Bush and Obama on international tax policy. Your background gives you a unique perspective as to how the U.S. election results might shape the future of global tax reform from the U.S. perspective. Well, it took 5 days, but after nearly all the votes have been counted, the United States will have a new president come January 20th. With the election of former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris as U.S. President and Vice President is good news for Democrats, the election results are mixed because it appears the Republicans retain control of the U.S. Senate. Let's assume these results hold and that a Biden administration takes office on January 20th with a Republican-controlled Senate. On day one, they're going to be looking down the barrel of a gun at 2 deadlines on global tax reform with the G20 and the OECD. What are those deadlines, and what do you see as the opportunities and pitfalls for the new administration as these deadlines approach?
Thanks for that great question, Stu. Let's first explain the calendar to listeners. The first event is the International Tax Symposium all-day event at the G20 Finance Ministers meeting on February 22nd. So just a month after the inauguration of President-elect Biden. Foreign sovereigns have set up a calendar of discussion and decision-making and international tax policy that gives the Biden administration insufficient time to get up to speed and potentially can affect whether they make the best choices for the US and the world in international tax diplomacy. And unfortunately, that might be intentional. I mean, there is a history of foreign sovereigns and the OECD Secretariat using the first G20 finance ministers meeting of a new US administration to try to extract concessions while a new administration is still getting its bearings and before it has a full set of conversations with the career staff in Treasury. And certainly the career staff in Treasury is sensitive to that. Here, I think that this timetable is really unfortunate for the world. I think a course correction that created a more appropriate timeline would create a much better chance of success in the G20 OECD process and thereby avoid risks of global trade tensions on DSTs. And moreover, I actually suspect the principal problem for the timetable here is not the OECD. The European Commission has repeatedly said in general terms that it strongly prefers a global agreement, but then in practical terms said over and over that if there is no agreement by June 2021, to quote the lead European Commission spokesperson on this issue, we will not blink. They say they'll move forward in July with their own approach. Well, as a practical matter, to my mind, the general statement of support for the OECD process and the more specific statement about how long they'll give the process seem kind of irreconcilable. Now that Joe Biden is president-elect, and I understand it might have been quite different if Donald Trump was president, the commission really should either clarify how or under what circumstances they'll allow the process to go on past July, or else they frankly should acknowledge that they're no longer supportive of the process. I think that's just an unvarnished assessment of where we are.
So we're looking down literally the barrel of a gun at the end of February and June of next year. It's a very narrow window of opportunity. We've seen the OECD kick the can down the road over the last couple of years on digital taxation. What do you think the odds are that that might happen?
I think that is a decision that is fundamentally not in the hands of the United States. It's in the hands of foreign sovereigns. And I think the Europeans play an important, but not the only important role in that question. But certainly the Europeans would need to conclude that their discussion about own resources for the EU in order to pay back the coronavirus bonds is not directly connected to OECD negotiations, or at least not connected in a way that requires some decision in Europe about which way to go by July 2021. That seems just asking for it not to work.
So assume, for sake of this discussion, that that tight window remains tight. What options do you see for an incoming Biden administration in terms of reaching a deal on digital taxation?
Well, I mean, I think realistically, the world's been thinking about a global deal on international tax, and it's fair to say the Trump administration was blocking it, although they were not the only obstacle. There are many other obstacles that others, that foreign sovereigns, when they talk about this, sweep under the rug. And in fact, the documents from the OECD make it really clear. You have like an endless set of obstacles that arise in the documents where you see different countries' interests. But there is real goodwill, and there is a real chance, and that is an amazing thing. This is a once in 100-year opportunity. So, I think the Biden administration should support a global process to achieve minimum taxation of multinational corporations. Certainly, it is clear that the Biden administration proposal is for to raise the U.S. GILTI rate and convert it to a country-by-country minimum tax, which, of course, the country-by-country approach is also the approach of the OECD. So there's an obvious, joining of the ways. The deal, of course, also can't just or primarily be that foreign governments get to tax U.S. tech companies more, and the U.S., through its foreign tax credit rules, then has to offset that additional foreign tax with a credit to those companies that in turn decreases U.S. government revenues. That is not a plausible result. A global deal has to be a balanced arrangement. I believe that this incoming administration, the Biden administration, one would expect them to want to engage in cooperative multilateralism. But there have to be partners who produce a reasonable timetable given the set of open issues that existed. And moreover, in thinking about the timetable, I think it's worth underscoring, especially for foreign listeners, that it's not just that you have from now until the end of June. I suspect foreign listeners don't know that under the Presidential Transition Act, the Biden folks are not able to communicate with the civil servants in the Treasury or other agencies until a specific Trump official, the General Services I'm going to say this wrong, the General Services Administration head, ascertains that Biden is the president-elect. And unlike in any other election, since that act has been law, the Trump administration is refusing to acknowledge that there is a new president-elect, so as to let the transition process start. And that's another complication, right? And not something that the president-elect's team can change. That's something the Trump people have to change. And I hope they do. And I hope they do.
So you have a narrow window of opportunity getting narrower. Now, the way the OECD has presented this, and they did back in October, that if a deal is not reached, then it's chaos. Then it's a lot of unilateral action. And we know about DSTs already because France has already done this. So to retaliate for France's imposition of a DST that many believe is aimed at large U.S. digital businesses, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on the importation of French wine and luxury goods. And although those tariffs were temporarily suspended until January, ostensibly to give the OECD time to reach consensus on taxation of digital commerce. Those tariffs are now set to take effect before President-elect Biden is sworn in. How do you see those tariffs and the potential for a parting gift of additional retaliatory tariffs against 10 other countries with DSTs affecting U.S. trade and international tax policy in a Biden administration?
So I actually think you got to split that up between the French tariffs and all the other ones, because it's important to understand. I mean, under current law, under what the USTR has done before the election, the United States Trade Representative, before the election, the tariffs on French goods in response to the French imposition of the DST are scheduled to begin before inauguration. So in the first week of January, those tariffs have begun, and that was decided before the election by some significant way. I think on that one, everything depends in part on the Biden administration and in part on Europe. I would expect the key message from the Biden administration, just, it's kind of obvious, but on both international tax issues and international economic issues, well beyond tax, they've just said, they want to be the cooperative multilateralists are back. And that message will be loud and clear. But then when it comes to the narrower question of tariffs on just the French, on luxury goods, in retaliation for DSTs, well, okay, that's a really narrow question relative to all the international economic law issues that are out there. Let's just be clear, okay? I think the question that the Biden administration will basically be forced to ask on that one is, how much cooperation are we getting in return? I mean, obviously, if the French repealed or postponed the imposition of their DST, then the Biden administration would immediately rescind the tariffs on the French as they're, in the first week. And that would be it. If the French keep the DST, it does become a little more complicated because no one in the US in either party believes the French DST is anything other than mercantilist. Just look at the bipartisan statements on that point from the U.S. Senate Finance Committee. I mean, in an era where the two parties can agree on almost nothing else in that committee, there's really clear statements. So the Biden administration will have to figure out how to proceed on the French DST while starting from the understanding that regardless of the disagreements in the United States about almost everything else the Trump administration did on trade, there is a bipartisan consensus that the Trump administration's United States Trade Representative's conclusion that the French DST is discriminatory was correct. Okay, now then there's all the other ones. The other ones would require action after the election by the USTR. That might be thought about differently. I'm not sure, right? But that is kind of different. So we'll see. I think the French, but I realistically think that the French DST is on its own in a special category, is my point.
It's certainly a lot to unpack, and you and I were talking about this earlier, and we've used the metaphor of three-dimensional chess. And if there's ever an appropriate metaphor for this, it is three-dimensional chess.
There are many moving pieces. There are many moving pieces on the trade side. There are many moving pieces on the tax side. The OECD has suggested that in the worst case, there is a 1% loss of global GDP if this all goes badly. So one would think that everyone would bring goodwill and want to take some more time, but some people are saying they don't want to take more time. So that's interesting. There are a lot of competing issues. Developing countries would like the STTR rule to be stronger. Some European countries would probably realistically prefer DSTs, although they would go along with other solutions. The Biden administration has a difficult but doable task in which if everyone else comes to the table in goodwill and putting aside all the acrimony that existed in the Trump administration, there's a real chance to change the international tax system in a profound way that matches anything that's been done at least since the 1920s.
You've certainly given us much food for thought as the incoming administration grapples with looming deadlines and threats of unilateral action against U.S. digital giants. Our guest today has been Itai Grinberg, professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. And I know our viewers really appreciate your time and your insightful comments. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Very welcome. It's been an honor to be with you, sir.
That wraps up this week's edition of Tax Takes News and Views, the week's news in a nutshell. From Barry Larking and myself, thank you for watching. Here's hoping your week is not too taxing.